All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to Module 3. We have a lot to cover again this morning, and so let's go ahead and dive right in. The main thing that we're going to be talking about this morning is what's known as the one-pot approach. I will explain that more as we get into it, but basically this is referring to the different categories or reasons that the juvenile justice might get involved. We're then going to shift and talk a little bit about peers and delinquency, talking just a little bit about gangs. Your writing assignment this week focuses on gangs, so I'm not going to dive real deep into that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about gender and delinquency, and specifically I want to take a look at a study that I think is very interesting, and that's called the Girls Study Group. So let's go ahead and jump in to talk about the one-pot approach. Basically, what this is referring to is the 4 different categories of juveniles that the juvenile justice system deals with. And when I think of this one-pot approach, I think of this cauldron, which is why I have that on your screen. I think of it as like, like a witch's brew, and we're putting all of these different things into the cauldron. And ultimately, this is one of the issues that the juvenile justice system deals with. It's sometimes considered a benefit of the juvenile justice system, and it's sometimes a drawback because of all of the different things one system is trying to do. Just one second, let me adjust my monitor. There we go. And so the first category that the juvenile justice system deals with is dependent youth. So ultimately, this category of juvenile, the kid themselves, or him or herself, has done absolutely nothing wrong. No delinquent act, no status offense. They've done absolutely nothing wrong. The issue is that they are unable to meet their own basic needs because they're simply not old enough to take care of themselves, but their parents are absent for whatever reason, whether it be incarceration, death, away at treatment. The parents aren't available to provide the basic needs for these children, and so they get classified as dependent youth. Social services tends to get involved, but that is dealt with in the juvenile justice system as the first category. So the juvenile justice system is dealing with dependent kids. The juvenile justice system is also dealing with neglected and abused kids. Now, those 2 types or issues are one category. We just call it neglected and abused. And again, these kids also have done absolutely nothing wrong, but the juvenile justice system needs to provide for them because their parents are either neglecting and or abusing them. Now, every state calls or deals with it a little bit different. I'm from Minnesota. We refer to these as CHIPS kids, or Minnesota CHIPS. CHIPS is actually an acronym, so if you can see in there, so Children in Need of Protective Services is the acronym that we use. So these kids need to be protected, most commonly from their parents. So again, these kids have done nothing wrong, but through research, we know that kids who are neglected and abused oftentimes become delinquent. There's a direct correlation between prior neglect and or abuse and future delinquency. So this is one of the reasons that the juvenile justice system really pays extra attention to this category of juveniles, because we know that being in this category can also lead to the next categories that we'll talk about in just a little bit. One of the things, and this always tends to come up, whether it be in the discussion forums or just in questions or in other types of discussions, is the idea of physical discipline. And I can't tell you, and it makes me crazy every single time I hear it, parents telling me, well, you know, you can't even spank your kid anymore. Absolutely, positively not true. You absolutely can spank your children as physical discipline if you deem that is appropriate. Actually, in Minnesota state statutes, as well as many other states, there's actually a separate statute section that deals with permitted actions, and that permitted action is the use of physical discipline. Where it becomes abuse is when it draws that line of causing injury or being excessive based on it. Now, what I can tell you is every single child psychologist in the nation will tell you that all the research says spanking is not an effective means of discipline. It is reactive. It doesn't prevent anything. It's not proactive. So child psychologists recommend that you not use spanking as a form of discipline. But the court absolutely doesn't intervene if the physical discipline is within the reasons and not causing injury, which then it becomes abuse. All right. The third category of the juvenile justice system is status offenders. Now, it's important that we distinguish between status offenses and delinquent acts. We already talked a little bit about status offenses last week, and we'll continue to talk about them in future weeks. But the way I keep them straight is a status offense is an issue or comes to our attention simply based on their age. So last week we talked about truancy. We'll talk about it a little bit more today. But so, of course, truancy is not going to school. That is a status offense. It is not a crime to be truant. Most of them are ordinance violations or petty misdemeanors. So it's only because of their age. So with truancy, if you are under the age of 16, or depending on what your state says when you can drop out, we're going to make sure you're in school. If you're not in school, it's a status offense because of your age. Once you graduate from high school, you as a college student, if you decide not to come to school, I don't want to say no one cares, but it's nowhere in the criminal code. And again, it's not a crime. A status offense is not a crime. It is generally an ordinance violation. So, for example, substance abuse is probably one of our most common status offenses. So smoking prior to the age of 18, alcohol prior to the age of 21, marijuana, depending on what state you're in, whether it's legal or not, all of those prior to the age that's outlined in statute is a status offense. Curfew violations, again, as an adult, no one cares what time you come home at night. Curfews are a status offense based on your age. Basically, the reason that curfews became so common and popular in cities and counties is because, again, research was done and found that in areas that implemented a curfew, they saw dramatic reductions in the numbers of burglary, theft, and assault. And so during the hours after the curfew was implemented. So ultimately, we believe that this was teens committing those, or that level of offense during these hours. So curfew violations were seen to reduce these particular crime categories. And so it's like every state, every city, every county implemented a curfew. Schliefer versus Charlottesville is actually a U.S. Supreme Court case. Charlottesville, North Carolina, the Schliefer family believed that their city had no business telling them as parents when their children needed to be home. So the Schliefer family, their child got was issued basically a ticket, a citation for curfew violation. They brought it to court, ended up appealing it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they said we as parents should have the ability to make the decision of when our child needs to be home. That's a parental decision, not a city decision, is what they were arguing. The U.S. Supreme Court sided with the city and said basically the need for public safety, the balancing act that we're always trying to do, the need for public safety overrides your ability to make decisions for your children. So Charlottesville won, which is why now that curfew violations or curfew ordinances are completely legal and don't violate the rights of the parents. I would really encourage you, we actually used to have a discussion forum about your local ordinance. I would really encourage you, if you don't know it already, to take a look at what your local ordinance says. And then sometimes it's kind of fun to compare and contrast. We have, like, I'm in St. Cloud, Minnesota. We have some suburbs, some neighboring cities. And I think it's interesting the great variation from city to city. And there is not an inclusion clause. So if my kid is in Sauk Rapids or Sartell and is there after their ordinance, it might be different than what mine is. You know, obviously their ordinance is what sets the precedent. So it's really important for you to know, especially for those of you that are parents, what your local ordinance is, and if you have neighboring communities that your children frequent, to know that what their ordinance is as well. All right. Another category of status offenses is running away. And so essentially why the system gets concerned about running away is that we know kids who run away are oftentimes running away from something, and that something where we get concerned is that something is oftentimes neglect or abuse that's happening in the home. We know that almost 60% of runaways are females, and many times girls who run away end up being sex trafficked, and it leads to, of course, a whole lot of other consequences for that. Yes, we know that kids run away because they don't like their parents' rules. That does create some of the runaway issues that we have. But we know a lot of kids are running away from something, and so that's where the system becomes involved. All right, so truancy is another status offense. We talked about it quite a bit last week, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time. Again, it is the most frequent status offense for kids under 15. It's a little bit of a misnomer there because most states allow kids to drop out after that age. Again, Minnesota, my state, I'm really proud of this. I put it on the slide 2 weeks in a row. We have compulsory attendance laws. We require kids to go to school until they're 16, yet we still rate second lowest in the nation. So we're definitely doing something right. And again, the reason we get so involved or concerned about truancy is we know that kids who are truant are not able to be successful in school, don't get good grades, don't pass, and that is a huge risk factor for delinquency. And so that correlation is why we have so many programs about truancy. Again, so I'm not going to put you on the spot, but for those of you participating live or those of you that will watch the recording, again, last week I did recommend you take a look at a video on this, that partnership between the OJJDP and the Department of Education created. If you didn't do that, I would encourage you to take a look at that. All right, then the fourth category of kids that the juvenile justice system deals with is delinquency. This is the category that these kids are exhibiting behaviors, are doing things that if they were an adult would have been considered criminal. But again, in the juvenile world, we don't call it crimes, we call it delinquent acts. Of the four, this is the only one that is indicative of criminal behavior. And so, again, this is our category of kids that the juvenile justice system is dealing with. Depending on where you're at, sometimes this is the largest category. Status offenses may also be the largest category. We see it kind of going back and forth between those two as what's the most common category. But those are the four different categories that the juvenile justice system is dealing with. All right, shifting gears then to peers and delinquency. Remember last week, I talked about the radio concept, where in the center we have is the youth. They're the nucleus of that cell. The area closest to that center is the family. They're the most influential. Just outside of that is the schools and peers. And then outside of that is the larger community. And so within that radio concept, remember the peers are the second most influential force on that youth. Ultimately, as we relate this to delinquency, we know that co-offending is extremely popular. Kids don't necessarily do a lot of delinquency on their own. They tend to do it in groups. Sometimes that group is just with one other kid, but co-offending is very, very common. And so that's one of the reasons, again, we look at your peers. And as I said last week, my dad used to always say, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And so we focus on that because we know this often happens in groups. This is consistent with a theory of criminal behavior known as social learning, in that we learn from those around us. And so we learn, if we have delinquent friends, we learn from them how to be delinquent. And so we seek out similar people to us, and that is consistent with the social learning theory. All right, as far as gangs go, as I said earlier, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about gangs because that is the foundation of your writing assignment this week. But ultimately, gangs is generally defined as 3 or more who commit delinquency together and do it generally for the benefit of their group. The formal definition, I encourage you to look at your state statute to see how you define a gang, because we do see some variations there, but that is a very, very general description of how a gang is identified. Now, gang is going to be the first part of the code for getting the credit of attending the live lecture or watching the archive of the live lecture. So the word gang is the first part of your code. All right, so diving just a little bit into gangs, a couple of things that I think are interesting is one of the things that we're seeing evolve is the age of gang members, the average age. We are seeing this getting much younger. We have identified kids as young as 8 who are legitimate gang members. We are also seeing folks as old as 55 still considering themselves to be a gang member, an active gang member. Some older folks, senior citizens, consider themselves lifers, but we're talking about active gang members who are committing crime to benefit their gang as old as 55. The average is most kids are hearing about gangs by age 9, joining by 11, and they are staying in the gang longer. So we're getting older into their adult world. Hands down, males comprise the majority of gangs. However, we do know the number of females who are actively in gangs is getting larger. When we look at the ethnic and racial composition of gangs, we do see this changing and evolving a little bit as well. Half of the gangs that we have identified are identified as Hispanic or Latino gangs. Most gangs, ethnic and racial composition, reflect their geographic location. So in areas where we have larger populations of different ethnic and racial groups, they tend to have those corresponding gangs or more of those corresponding gangs in those particular areas. One of the things that I think is interesting is Asian gangs, and just little bits and pieces of facts having to do with gangs. Asian gangs tend to victimize their own. They victimize other Asians. African American gangs, similar to our geographic compositions of our nation, we do see African American gangs dispersed across the United States. We're seeing an increase in the population of skinheads as well, especially in prisons. I actually just saw a report that number has increased dramatically in our prison population. All right, why? So we will talk more about theories of juvenile delinquency at the end of the term, but when we talk about why someone joins a gang, we basically can break it down into 3 different categories of criminology, which is the study of why someone commits crime. Some of the earliest theories focused on biology, and we're consistent with the biological school of criminology in that, similar to our early tribes, this becoming mature and a mature member of the tribe, there's an initiation period. We see some of that gang initiation being very similar to some of those early tribal practices, and because a lot of them included violence. And so that's where this biological connection has come into play in our earliest explanations of gang, why someone might join a gang. We also see a family heritage, which when people talk about family, they immediately say, is it something biological? Where generally we see this generational in gang members. So the trend then is to, if it's generational, is it also biological? I can't say whether it is or not. There's some research that says it is, some research that says it isn't, but that's one of the theories that is out there. One of the theories that makes the most sense to me is social disorganization theory. Basically, social disorganization is present when in areas that has high poverty rates, high levels of stress, and limited resources. Social disorganization says crime is higher in those areas that experience poverty, high levels of stress, limited resources as far as academic or educational systems, and jobs. That creates a system of anomie, and basically anomie is there are no norms. Whatever it takes to survive is your norm. There's no norm, there's no social structure, sense of community, and so that's where gangs thrive, because there's no norms, there's no sense of community to kind of keep things together and functioning and organized. And so social disorganization is this idea where there are no norms, that's where gangs thrive. The last theory that tends to apply is rational choice. We know that you can always choose not to. And so some feel that they make a rational decision to join a gang, whether it be for their personal safety, because they see it as fun. It's a sense of family. That whole thug lifestyle is intriguing or interesting to them, and so they make a rational choice to join that gang. We see our entire criminal justice system working towards trying to prevent gang membership and then responding, being reactive to gang membership. So we're trying to prevent it, and that we can't prevent, we are responding to it, and we see our whole criminal justice system dealing with this. From our court system and our legislatures, as far as the legal aspects, we are passing new laws to try to control gangs, where there's increased charges as well as punishments if the crime is considered to be done in the benefit or for the benefit of a gang. The RICO statute, which stands for Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization. I'll repeat that for you. RICO is Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization. This is federal legislation that was originally passed to deal with the mafia, because state laws, the mafia was absolutely out of control, and state laws weren't doing enough. So the federal government stepped in and said, and passed this RICO statute that says if you are found to be committing crime to benefit the mafia, the federal government is going to take over, charge you with violation of the RICO statute, which carries very, very long prison terms. In recent years, the RICO statute began to apply to gangs. Really, when you look at what gangs are doing and the crime that's committing to benefit the gang, it falls under the RICO statute. So it provides us another way to try to prevent criminal behavior done by gangs as well as response. When we're able to slap that RICO statute on gang members as far as criminal charges go, we basically can incarcerate them for longer periods of time. We know law enforcement is actively involved in trying to prevent programs such as GREAT, which is Gang Resistance Education and Training, is an attempt, it's similar to the DARE program, but it's an attempt to prevent kids from joining gangs. And we know we also have special units sometimes within a law enforcement agency to respond to gang violence. We also know the correctional system is involved. We have prison programs to try to help gang members leave a gang, whether it be through, we have tattoo removal programs, keeping gang members separate in prison, and having zero tolerance for gang violence within the prison walls. So we see corrections trying to help and prevent as well. We also see the community as well as school programs trying to prevent and respond to gang issues. Remember that radio concept, the community is just outside the peers, and so they play an active role as well. All right, shifting gears to talk just a little bit about gender and delinquency. So first and foremost, we know as far as current statistics go, and I should probably have these backwards, hands down, boys commit more crime, 4 to 1. Are boys versus girls committing delinquent acts. And so boys remain our most common committer of delinquent acts. Leading risk factor of delinquency is gender, being a boy, 4 to 1. However, we do see right now the rate of girls committing delinquent acts increasing faster than boys. So then we have to step back and say, okay, why? Or what role is gender involved in both boys and girls? So the first thing we want to look at is hormones. We know that's the primary difference between boys and girls is essentially the presence of testosterone. There's been some studies done that looked at boys that were in the juvenile justice system, basically boys that were being housed in a detention center versus boys in the general population that have not committed delinquent acts. And one of the studies found that the boys that were in the detention center actually had higher levels of testosterone than the general public does. We also see the same study done on girls and estrogen, having higher levels of estrogen than boys. So one possible option is we know that hormones play a role, and dependent on our levels of hormones may influence our delinquent behaviors. Mental health. We know kids that are being housed in detention centers have higher rates of mental health diagnoses than kids of the general population. And so is that correlation, is it causation? We don't necessarily know, but we just know that mental health diagnoses are higher in the juvenile population rates. So ultimately then, we need to look at society. So we talk about biology, then we need to also take a look at what role is society playing in this difference between boys and girls. So when we look at the issues at home, specific to girls that are involved in the juvenile justice system, and mainly who we're studying here are girls that are being housed in a detention center. So we're asking these girls to describe and discuss their home life. What's interesting is girls report more dysfunction at home than boys. When we ask them how would they classify their level of dysfunction, and we give them examples of what dysfunction means, and the girls report higher levels than boys. However, where we have to be careful there is we can't necessarily dictate how girls and boys interpret dysfunction. We know girls tend to be more dramatic than boys. So a boy might say, you know, yeah, my dad's an alcoholic, but my mom takes care of everything else. And so not necessarily see that as dysfunction. where a girl is going to interpret that as very, very high dysfunction. And so the one study found that, yep, girls report more dysfunction in their homes than boys. We always have to be careful with any study on what are other variables that might be influencing that. We also know that girls tend to report higher levels of abuse in the home. Again, this could be their interpretation, but this particular study found that girls report higher levels of abuse. As I already said, we know that there's a direct link between, or correlation between kids who are neglected and abused and future delinquency. So girls report higher levels of abuse in the home. They also link abuse in the home to gang participation. So we then have to question, is that why we're seeing more girls joining gangs now than we used to see? And then runaways. As I said, they're about 60%, just shy of 60% of runaways are girls. And again, they tend to be running away from something. So we tend to look at what's going on in their home. All right, one of my favorite studies, as I said earlier, is called the Girls Study Group. This was a study that was started by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in 2008. However, now 10 years later, that study is still going. We are still collecting data and on these research questions through this study, so it's ongoing, and we're actively using this data to create programs and policies. So basically, the Girls Study Group, when the study began, they basically wanted to ask 3 different questions and have basically 3 different pieces of this particular study group. So the 3 questions that they asked is, which girls become delinquent? What factors put girls at risk for delinquency? And then what factors protected girls from delinquency? So rather than asking, to not only asking why does someone become delinquent, we also need to ask the question, why not? And so based on those 3 questions, they basically broke the study down into 3 different parts. Study 1 looked at, or was called Violence by Teenage Girls, Trends and Context. So basically this looked at the existing data as far as who's committing status offense, who's committing delinquent acts, and what trends that we are seeing in the field. So this is looking at UCR reports, so the Uniform Crime Report, official law enforcement data. We're talking to schools, what they're seeing, and we're talking about self-reports when kids are reporting their own delinquency. So ultimately, when we looked at this whole big picture of the level of delinquent acts that are being committed as well as status offenses, we saw that overall, juvenile crime is lower. It's lower than it's been in many, many years. However, what was really interesting is when we looked at those overall rates, it's lower for boys than it is for girls. So we've seen more drops in boys than we are for girls. So then the question then becomes, so does that mean girls are committing more crime? It absolutely positively could mean that. But as a good researcher, we need to say, or is it something else? And basically, 2 things came into play when we asked that question. When we looked at just self-reports, so remember this is where every year we ask a cross-section of boys and girls, what delinquent acts have you committed that if you would have been caught, would have been committed a crime? We know that it's almost universal. And so what's interesting is in that self-reports, when we broke it down by girls and boys, we really didn't see any change from girls and boys. So that doesn't necessarily account for why it's lower, but more so for boys. So then the other thing we have to say is, what else could be influencing this? And one of the possible reasons is changes that we're seeing in law enforcement. We see law enforcement evolving to where officers are much more willing to bring a juvenile into custody, a juvenile girl, into custody or into the system than they used to be. Many times it used to be that if it was a girl, they would just simply send the girl home. Boys, they were more likely to bring into the system. We're not seeing that trend quite as much anymore. So this whole idea that we're seeing an increase in juveniles coming into the system simply could be explained by how law enforcement is responding to those girls. I'm not necessarily saying that's the only reason, but it certainly could be one of the reasons. So that's what the first study is looking at, is just overall trends in juvenile crime rates. The second study looks specifically at causes and correlates of girls, and that's what the second study is called. And so ultimately it looked at what influences both genders and then what seems to influence just girls more. So some of this we've already talked about. So factors that influence both genders: family dynamics, the level of parental supervision, family criminal history is what CH is, criminal history, child maltreatment. So family dynamics influences both genders. Involvement in school. Kids who are involved in school are less likely to be delinquent. Where they're from, simply the neighborhood and the dynamics of the neighborhood, influences both boys and girls as far as their levels of delinquency, as well as availability of programs that boys and girls can participate in, whether it be after school programs, sports programs, theater, arts, boys and girls clubs, things like that, places for them to go, tends to influence both genders as far as future delinquency goes. This study then took it one step further and said, okay, what seems to influence girls more than boys? And they came up with several different things. The first is early puberty. Girls that experience puberty younger than other girls are also more likely to become a delinquent. History of sexual abuse tends to influence girls more so than boys. Girls who have a history of sexual abuse are more likely to become delinquent than boys are. Girls that suffer from depression and anxiety are more likely to become delinquent than boys who also express that they are suffering from depression and anxiety. Girls that have romantic partners earlier, if their boyfriend is delinquent, they are more likely to become delinquent as well. It is not true for vice versa. Boys who are delinquent that have a girlfriend, that doesn't necessarily influence the girlfriend as much as it does as when those roles are reversed. All right, then the last study looked at, again, remember I talked about it's just as important to look at why kids are delinquent as we are to look at why kids aren't delinquent. So specific to girls, looking at, okay, why the group of girls that we have that are not delinquent, why not? What's going on in their world? So this particular study was called Resilient Girls, Factors That Protect Against Delinquency. Support from a caring adult, whether it be a parent, a teacher, a mentor, Girl Scout troop leader, coach. Girls that feel that they have the support of a caring adult are less likely to become delinquent than boys who report the same thing. Success in school, basically measured by GPAs. Girls that do well in school tend to not become delinquent. It's a protection factor for both, but girls it tends to be more influential. School connectedness, being involved. Remember last week we talked about the 3 A's? Kids that are active in their school and connected to their school to someone or something tend to not be delinquent. Then the last factor is religiosity. Kids that practice some type of religious belief or belong to some type of religious community, doesn't matter what religion. Kids that express religiosity are, and girls specifically, are less likely to become delinquent than boys. All right, so that wraps up the content review. So let's take a look at the assignments because there's quite a bit going on this week. So for reading, you have 4 chapters. That sounds like a lot, but the chapters are relatively short. You also need to read the article published by the OJDDP. All these are listed in that lessons folder of Module 3. Read the article by Fickelman, and as well as the lecture notes. For the writing assignment this week, you will examine a presentation done by the Comprehensive Gang module. The link is in there. I also put a direct link in my announcements yesterday. Basically, so there are several questions listed that you need to respond to after reviewing the presentation. You need to answer those questions in essay form. I do not want question, answer, question, answer. It needs to be in APA format, so include a title page, word the question into a sentence, and have like the first paragraph should be your introductory paragraph with a thesis statement. You know, this essay is going to answer questions based on the Comprehensive Gang model. Then the second paragraph incorporate the first question into a sentence, respond to that first question, make sure you cite the Comprehensive Gang model in text as well as in the reference page. So answer all of those questions in essay form, including in-text citation as well as the reference page. The discussion forum takes a look at gender responsiveness. Second part of the code for this week's lecture is the word gender. So basically, in your discussion forum, you need to define this concept as it applies to juvenile justice. So define in your own words gender responsiveness as it applies to juvenile justice. Then you need to talk about two different strategies that support gender responsiveness as they apply to juvenile justice. This is also a concept in the adult world. We're just looking at juvenile justice. You need to respond to a student who chose a different strategy. Make sure you compare and contrast your responses, talk about the benefits and drawbacks of each. All right, so last week I encouraged you to start working on the project because this week the outline is due. So in week 1, you chose your topic. Week 2, I encourage you to start doing the research because the outline was due in week 3. If you didn't do that, that means you have a lot of work to do. This is a persuasive essay where what you need to talk about is already determined for you, which I think is a benefit to you. So ultimately, based on your topic, you need to cover the history, the current status, 2 benefits, 2 drawbacks, and your opinion. In the assignment explanation, there is a sample outline. Follow that basic format and include those basic things. In my announcement that I have posted on Monday, I included a link for you to click on to give you another example of what this outline should look like. So make sure you're reviewing all of those resources and incorporating those suggestions into your own outline based on your topic. There's a quiz this week. Basically, you have 50 minutes to respond to 25 questions. Again, as always, make sure you read the announcements. Yesterday, I posted an announcement on Monday that clarified all of the expectations for this week. And throughout the week, I'll include probably 2 more announcements just to talk about more of the content and the objectives that are met this week. All right, that is all I have for you. Thanks so much for your participation. As always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. For those of you that are on the call live, I'm actually going to stop the recording now, but we'll stay on to answer any questions that you have. Thanks and have a good week.